My father-in-law drugged my wedding champagne, and thank God he did. My father-in-law, Robert, grabbed my champagne flute seconds before the toast and dumped something into it while 200 wedding guests watched him. I was standing at the head table in my $8,000 wedding dress when he stumbled toward me with a pill bottle in one hand and my drink in the other. My new husband, Derek, lunged across the table trying to stop him, screaming that his father had lost his mind. Robert shoved Derek backward into the wedding cake and held the glass toward my mouth, saying, "Drink this right now, Natalie. Trust me, and drink every drop." My mother was already calling 911 about a drunk man drugging the bride while guests pulled out their phones filming everything. My bridesmaids grabbed my arms, pulling me away from Robert while the groomsmen tackled him to the ground. The champagne spilled across the white tablecloth, and Robert kept yelling that I needed to drink it before Derek gave me the other glass. Security guards from the venue were running toward us, and Derek was wiping cake frosting off his tuxedo, saying his father had dementia and hadn't taken his medication. My maid of honor whispered that we should call an ambulance because Robert looked genuinely terrified instead of drunk or confused. The bottle he'd been holding rolled across the floor, and my cousin picked it up, reading the label out loud. "Rohypnol. That's a date rape drug. Why does your father-in-law have roofies at your wedding?" Everyone froze and stared at the pill bottle while Robert stopped fighting the groomsmen holding him down. He looked straight at me with tears running down his face and said, "Check Derek's jacket pocket right now. The inside left one. There's another bottle, and he was going to use it on you and 4 other women here tonight." Derek's face changed into something I had never seen in the 2 years we dated. His jaw clenched and his eyes went completely cold before he smiled and said his father was having a psychotic break and we needed to get him to a hospital immediately. But my brother was already moving toward Derek, asking him to empty his pockets to clear this up. Derek backed toward the exit, saying he would not be searched like a criminal at his own wedding because his father made insane accusations. My dad blocked the door and told Derek if he had nothing to hide, then showing his empty pockets would end this nightmare. The wedding coordinator was on the phone with police, saying there was a situation with drugs at the Riverside Hotel ballroom. Derek's hand moved toward his jacket, and I saw him weighing whether to run or fight. Then he grabbed my 16-year-old cousin Melissa by her hair and pulled a folding knife from his sock, pressing it against her throat. Everyone started screaming, and Derek dragged Melissa backward toward the kitchen entrance while telling everyone to get away from the doors or he would kill her. My cousin was crying and clawing at Derek's arm around her throat while he kept the knife blade pressed under her jaw. The security guards had their hands up, trying to talk him into letting her go, but Derek was already through the kitchen door. We heard Melissa screaming, and then a crash, and then nothing. My uncle ran through the door first and found Derek unconscious on the tile floor with a line cook standing over him holding a cast-iron skillet. Melissa was huddled against the industrial refrigerator with a small cut on her neck but otherwise unharmed. The cook said Derek backed into the kitchen, not watching where he was going, and he saw the knife, so he hit him with the nearest heavy object. Police sirens were already close and getting closer while my brother held Derek's arms behind his back. My dad pulled a pill bottle from Derek's inside jacket pocket exactly where Robert said it would be. Same label, same drug, 12 pills missing from a prescription that was not in Derek's name. Robert was still on the floor with groomsmen holding him down even though he had stopped fighting. He kept saying he was sorry for ruining my wedding, but he could not let Derek go through with his plan. I dropped beside Robert, asking what plan and how did he know about the drugs. He told me to check Derek's phone because he had been tracking Derek's location and reading his messages for the past 3 weeks after finding disturbing search history on the family computer. The police arrived and immediately handcuffed Derek, who was just starting to wake up from being hit with the skillet. They found the knife and both pill bottles and asked who wanted to press charges for assault with a deadly weapon. Melissa was shaking so hard her mom had to hold her up while giving a statement about the knife at her throat. Robert handed his phone to the lead detective, showing text messages between Derek and someone named Steven discussing their plan for tonight. The messages talked about 5 targets, including me, and described how they would move us to a secondary location after we were drugged. The detective's face went pale reading through the conversation. She asked Robert how he got access to Derek's messages, and Robert explained he had installed monitoring software on Derek's phone 3 weeks ago after discovering searches for bulk rohypnol and chloroform on the family computer. He said he waited to act because he needed Derek to bring the drugs to a public place with witnesses before he could prove what his son was planning. My hands were shaking so badly I could not hold Robert's phone to read the messages myself. The detective asked me to identify the other 4 women Derek had mentioned as targets in his texts. I looked around the ballroom trying to understand who else he was planning to drug at our wedding. The detective read the descriptions from Derek's messages out loud to help identify his targets. Young women between 16 and 24 years old traveling alone without male relatives nearby with blonde or light brown hair under 130 pounds, and most importantly, women who had expressed interest in the photography studio Derek ran downtown. My stomach dropped because I knew exactly who fit that description. My cousin Melissa, who Derek had grabbed, was already one. My best friend's younger sister Amber, who was 19, and had done a modeling shoot at Derek's studio last month. A college friend named Sophie, who had asked Derek about senior portraits 2 weeks ago at our engagement party. My coworker's daughter Rachel, who was 17 and wanted to build a portfolio for art school applications. All 4 of them plus me were his targets, and all 4 of them were here tonight without their parents or boyfriends. I pointed them out to the detective one by one across the ballroom and watched as officers moved to speak with each of them. Amber started crying when they told her what Dererick had planned. Sophie threw up in a trash can by the bar. Rachel's mother showed up right then to pick her up and started screaming about pressing charges when the officer explained why they needed to interview her daughter. Robert was still sitting on the floor with his head in his hands, saying he should have acted sooner, but he needed ironclad evidence before accusing his own son of something this evil. The detective asked him to unlock his phone so they could download all the messages and search history he had collected. Robert handed it over without hesitation and asked if his cooperation would help reduce whatever charges he faced for drugging my champagne. The detective said she would note in her report that Robert had prevented multiple kidnappings and possibly murders based on the messages describing the secondary location. She showed me one message where Dererick told Stephen they could get at least $40,000 per girl from their contacts overseas who paid premium prices for American women in that age range. Stephen had responded saying their buyer in Moldova was waiting for the shipment and had already wired the first payment. My vision tunneled and I had to sit down before I fell down. This was human trafficking. My husband of 6 hours had planned to sell me and 4 other women to sex traffickers on our wedding night. The detective asked if I wanted to press charges and I said yes to everything possible. Then I asked how Robert knew to act tonight specifically when Dererick could have changed his plan at any moment. Robert explained he had been watching Dererick's location data constantly for 3 weeks and saw Dererick meet with Stephen at a storage unit yesterday afternoon. Robert followed them and watched through a gap in the door as they loaded rope, duct tape, zip ties, a stun gun, and 5 large duffel bags into Stephen's van. He took photos of everything, including the van's license plate, and texted them to himself as evidence. Then he tracked Dererick's phone to a pharmacy where security footage would later show Dererick picking up the Rohypnol prescription using a fake ID. Robert knew the wedding was when Dererick planned to act because the messages discussed using the champagne toast as the delivery method when everyone would be drinking and distracted. Robert bought the same drug from a black market contact he knew from his days as a police officer and brought it to the wedding. His plan was to drug me first with a smaller non-lethal dose that would make me visibly ill before Dererick could give me the larger dose meant to completely incapacitate me. Robert needed me to get sick publicly so the wedding would be canceled and Dererick's opportunity would disappear. But he also needed physical evidence of drugs in Dererick's possession, so he goaded Dererick into a confrontation that would lead to him being searched. The whole scene with grabbing my glass and dumping pills in it was theater designed to force Dererick's hand and make him reveal the drugs he was carrying. The detective confirmed Robert's story by checking his phone's location history and finding the photos of the storage unit contents. She called for additional units to go to the storage address and the pharmacy Dererick had visited. Within 30 minutes, officers at the storage unit found everything Robert had photographed, plus 5 sets of women's clothing in different sizes and 5 passports with blank photo pages. At the pharmacy, they pulled security footage showing Dererick using a fake medical license to obtain controlled substances. The evidence was overwhelming, and Dererick's lawyer, who showed up an hour later, took one look at everything and advised Dererick to cooperate fully. But Dererick refused to speak without a deal, so they transported him to county jail and charged him with 5 counts of attempted kidnapping, possession of controlled substances with intent to distribute, conspiracy to commit human trafficking, and assault with a deadly weapon for holding the knife to Melissa's throat. Bond was set at $2 million, which Dererick could not afford even after liquidating all his assets. His photography studio was searched that same night, and investigators found a hidden room behind a false wall in the basement. Inside, they discovered recording equipment, restraints bolted to the floor, and a laptop containing videos of at least 15 different women being photographed in compromising positions without their knowledge. Timestamps on the files showed Dererick had been drugging clients at his studio for the past 18 months. My mother had to be sedated by paramedics after hearing about the hidden room and what Dererick had been doing to his clients. My father sat in the hotel parking lot in his rental tuxedo, staring at nothing for over an hour while police finished processing the scene. All 200 wedding guests had given statements and left by midnight while I sat in the ballroom still wearing my wedding dress talking to detectives. They asked about any warning signs I had missed, and I kept saying there were none because Dererick had been perfect. Attentive, romantic, never pushy or controlling, supportive of my career, respectful to my family, and completely normal in every way that mattered. The detective said that was how predators operated, by building trust and maintaining a flawless public image while hiding their true nature. She told me 14 women in the videos from Dererick's studio had already been identified and contacted. All of them thought they had simply fallen asleep during their photo sessions from exhaustion or low blood sugar. None of them realized they had been drugged and photographed unconscious. The detective said I was incredibly lucky Robert had discovered what Dererick was planning before the wedding happened. She estimated I had maybe 20 minutes of consciousness left after Dererick gave me his champagne before I would have been completely incapacitated and vulnerable to being moved without resistance. Robert was released without charges after the prosecutor reviewed his cooperation and determined his actions had prevented serious felonies. The district attorney made a public statement praising Robert's courage in exposing his own son and likely saving multiple lives. But Robert told me he felt nothing like a hero when he came to my house 3 days after the wedding that never happened. He stood in my parents' living room crying and apologizing for not raising Dererick better and for not seeing the monster his son had become. I asked him how he first suspected something was wrong, and Robert said it started 2 months ago when Dererick borrowed the family computer and forgot to clear his browsing history. Robert saw searches for date rape drugs, human trafficking routes through Eastern Europe, and how to bypass airport security with unconscious passengers. At first, he thought maybe Derek was researching something for a podcast or true crime hobby. But then Robert found the fake medical license hidden in Derek's desk drawer at home, along with business cards for 3 different shell companies Derek had registered in Delaware. Robert hired a private investigator who discovered Derek had traveled to Moldova twice in the past year, using a passport under a different name. The investigator also found Derek's real name connected to an Interpol watch list for suspected involvement in an international trafficking ring. Robert showed me the investigator's full report sitting at my parents' kitchen table while my mother made coffee none of us drank. The report detailed how Derek had been recruited by Stephen during college when they both worked at a nightclub downtown. Stephen was already involved in trafficking and saw Derek's photography studio as perfect cover for identifying and grooming potential victims. They had successfully trafficked 8 women in the past 3 years according to Interpol's estimates, based on money transfers and travel patterns. The women who appeared in Derek's hidden room videos were not their actual victims, because those women had cooperated and been photographed normally. The unconscious recordings were Derek practicing his drugging technique and timing, so he would know exactly how much Rohypnol to use for complete incapacitation without overdose. He needed his victims alive and undamaged to get full payment from buyers overseas. The investigator had traced $180,000 in deposits to Derek's offshore accounts over the past 3 years, with payment notes describing merchandise delivery and customer satisfaction. My throat closed up reading those words because merchandise meant women and customer satisfaction meant rape, and I had almost been part of that supply chain. Robert put his hand on my shoulder and said he would understand if I never wanted to see him again because his son had planned to destroy my life. I told Robert he saved my life and I would be grateful to him forever, no matter what happened next. My father agreed and said Robert showed more integrity and courage than most men would in his position. Turning in your own child for crimes this serious was not something most parents could do even with overwhelming evidence. Robert said he struggled with denial for weeks after finding the initial evidence because Derek was his only child, and admitting what Derek had become meant admitting Robert had failed as a father. But Robert's wife had died from cancer 6 years ago, and one of her last requests was that Robert always choose what was right over what was easy. She made him promise never to look away from evil even if it meant losing everything he loved. So Robert had investigated Derek thoroughly, documented everything meticulously, and waited for the perfect moment to expose him publicly where Derek could not escape or destroy evidence. The wedding was ideal because Derek would have the drugs on his person, all his targets would be present, and there would be hundreds of witnesses to whatever happened. Robert knew drugging my champagne would create chaos, but he also knew it would force Derek to either submit to being searched or reveal his guilty conscience by running. Either outcome would lead to Derek's arrest and stop the trafficking plan. The media coverage started the next morning with every local news station running stories about the wedding that ended in a human trafficking arrest. My name was kept confidential as a victim, but Robert's identity was published along with Derek's mugshot and the charges against him. Robert's phone rang constantly with interview requests and book deal offers, which he declined. He said profiting from exposing his son's crimes would dishonor his wife's memory and the victims Derek had hurt. Stephen was arrested 2 days later trying to board a flight to Moldova with $60,000 cash and a laptop containing encrypted files about their trafficking operation. Federal investigators broke the encryption and found detailed records of 31 women who had been trafficked over the past 8 years through the network Stephen managed. Derek and Stephen were apparently mid-level operators taking orders from someone higher up who federal agents were still trying to identify. The FBI asked me to testify before a grand jury about Derek's behavior and our relationship to help them build a pattern of manipulation and deception. I spent 4 hours answering questions about how Derek had isolated me from friends, convinced me to quit my job at the law firm, and persuaded me to add his name to my savings account containing $40,000 from my grandmother's inheritance. The FBI agent explained Derek's pattern was to identify women with assets or family money, romance them quickly, marry them legally to gain access to their finances, then traffic them before they realized anything was wrong. The $40,000 in my account would have been drained and transferred offshore within hours of me being drugged at the wedding. 4 of Derek's previous girlfriends had similar experiences of quick romances followed by sudden disappearances after lending Derek money or co-signing loans. None of them had reported it to police because Derek always had plausible explanations like business emergencies or family crises requiring him to leave town suddenly. The FBI tracked these women down and interviewed them as part of their investigation. All 4 confirmed Derek had pressured them to cut contact with protective friends and family members who expressed concerns about the relationship moving too fast. Derek would frame it as defending their love against jealous outsiders who wanted to break them up. It was classic isolation and grooming behavior designed to leave victims vulnerable with no support system when he decided to act. I recognized every single manipulation tactic they described because Derek had used all of them on me over the past 18 months. My annulment paperwork was filed within a week and granted immediately given Derek's arrest and fraud charges. The judge apologized for what I had been through and said the marriage was void due to Derek's fraudulent intent from the beginning. I got my maiden name back and felt like I could breathe again without Derek's last name attached to mine. But then my bank called saying Derek had attempted to access my account from jail using the online banking credentials I had given him. He tried to transfer my entire savings to an offshore account, but the bank's fraud detection stopped the transaction. They froze the account and required me to appear in person with identification to regain access. When I went to the bank, the manager showed me Dererick had been slowly moving money out of my account for months. Small transfers of $500 or $800 that I had not noticed because Dererick handled our finances and I trusted him completely. He had stolen over $12,000 before being arrested, and I would need to file a police report to potentially recover it through restitution. The manager also discovered Dererick had opened 3 credit cards in my name using my social security number. All 3 were maxed out with a combined balance of $35,000 for purchases I never made. I had to file identity theft reports and fraud disputes with every credit bureau while my credit score plummeted. My mother helped me sort through the financial mess Dererick had created while my father met with lawyers about suing Dererick for damages. But Dererick had no assets left after liquidating everything to try making bail. His photography studio was seized by federal investigators as evidence. His apartment was rented, so there was no property to claim. His car was leased and already repossessed. The offshore accounts were frozen but mostly empty because Dererick had spent lavishly on maintaining his cover as a successful businessman. My lawyer explained I could get a judgment against Dererick, but collecting on it would be nearly impossible since he was facing decades in prison. The best I could hope for was restitution ordered as part of his criminal sentence, but victims rarely saw full repayment in cases like this. I would have to rebuild my finances from scratch while dealing with the emotional trauma of almost being trafficked by my own husband. My therapist said it was normal to feel violated and betrayed on multiple levels. Dererick had not only planned to kidnap and sell me, but had also stolen from me, isolated me, and manipulated every aspect of our relationship. The person I thought I loved never existed. Dererick had been playing a role designed to exploit my vulnerabilities and trust. The preliminary hearing was held 6 weeks after the arrest, and I had to sit in the courtroom watching Dererick in his orange jumpsuit. He looked thinner and paler but showed no remorse or emotion during the proceedings. The prosecutor presented evidence of the trafficking conspiracy, including messages between Dererick and Stephen discussing previous successful deliveries of merchandise. They had code words for everything. Packages meant women. Shipment meant transporting victims across borders. Client satisfaction meant the women had been accepted and payment received. The messages were clinical and cold, with Dererick discussing human beings as if they were products being moved through a supply chain. One message complained about a previous package being damaged during shipment and the client demanding a discount. Federal investigators later determined that message referred to a woman named Amanda, who had been trafficked 18 months ago and was found dead in a Moldova hotel room from apparent suicide. But the medical examiner's report noted injuries consistent with severe physical abuse. Dererick and Stephen had known Amanda was being tortured and did nothing because they had already received their payment. The prosecutor said Dererick showed a complete lack of empathy or human decency that made him an ongoing danger to society. Dererick's lawyer argued for reduced charges, claiming Dererick was a victim himself, who had been coerced by Stephen into participating in the trafficking ring. But the prosecutor presented Dererick's bank records showing he had been receiving payments for 3 years before ever meeting Stephen. Dererick had started trafficking women during college using connections from his photography business. Stephen joined later and helped expand the operation, but Dererick was never a victim. He was a willing participant who had refined his predatory skills over time. The judge reviewed all the evidence and ruled there was sufficient cause to proceed to trial on all charges. Dererick was remanded to custody without bond, and his lawyer's motion for release was denied. I felt a small measure of relief knowing Dererick would stay locked up until trial. But that relief was complicated by fear of what would happen if he was somehow acquitted or given a light sentence. The prosecutor assured me the evidence was overwhelming and conviction was almost certain. But she also warned me that trials could take years and Dererick would use every legal maneuver to delay justice. I needed to prepare for a long fight and could not let the process consume my life in the meantime. Robert visited me weekly to check how I was coping and offer support. He had aged visibly since the wedding, with new lines around his eyes and gray spreading through his hair. Exposing Dererick had destroyed Robert's relationship with his extended family, who blamed him for not handling things privately. Robert's brother stopped speaking to him after Robert testified at the preliminary hearing. Robert's sister sent him a letter saying he should have protected Dererick instead of sending him to prison. She claimed family loyalty meant standing by Dererick no matter what he had done. Robert showed me the letter with shaking hands and said he could not understand how his siblings thought trafficking human beings was something families should cover up. I told Robert his wife would be proud of him for keeping his promise to always choose what was right. He cried then and said he hoped I was right, but most days he felt like a failure who had raised a monster without noticing. I reminded him that Dererick had fooled everyone, including me and my entire family. Dererick was intelligent, calculating, and skilled at deception. Robert could not have known what Dererick was hiding any more than I could have known what my fiancé was planning on our wedding night. The 4 other women Dererick had targeted at my wedding all filed civil lawsuits against him for emotional distress and attempted kidnapping. Melissa's family sued for $2 million, citing the knife wound on her neck and ongoing trauma from being held hostage. Amber sued for $1.5 million because Dererick had drugged her once before during the modeling shoot at his studio, and she had woken up with missing time and no memory of parts of the session. Sophie sued for $1 million after discovering she appeared in one of the unconscious videos from Dererick's hidden room. Rachel's parents sued for $3 million as her legal guardians because she was still a minor when Dererick targeted her. None of these lawsuits would likely recover significant money, but they established a legal record of Dererick's victims and gave each woman a sense of control in seeking justice. The prosecutor said the civil suits also created additional legal pressure on Dererick to accept a plea deal, rather than face multiple trials. But Dererick continued refusing any deal that involved admitting guilt or accepting responsibility for his actions. His lawyer filed motions claiming the search of his studio was illegal, and all evidence found there should be suppressed. The judge denied the motion after reviewing the warrant and finding it properly executed based on probable cause from Robert's initial evidence. Federal investigators traced Dererick's trafficking network backward through financial records and travel documents. They identified 19 additional victims who had been trafficked through Dererick's operation over the past 6 years. Interpol located 11 of these women alive in various countries, being held in brothels or private homes as domestic slaves. The women were rescued and repatriated to the United States, but most were severely traumatized and required extensive medical and psychological care. 3 victims could not be found and were presumed dead based on witness statements and circumstantial evidence. 5 victims were confirmed dead through death certificates and autopsy reports. The FBI's Victim Services Unit contacted me about joining a support group for survivors of trafficking or attempted trafficking. I attended one meeting and met a woman named Gabrielle who had been trafficked by Dererick 4 years ago, when she was 22. Gabrielle had been rescued from Moldova after 8 months in captivity and returned to the United States physically and emotionally destroyed. She spent 3 years in intensive therapy before she could function normally again. Gabrielle told me she still had nightmares about Dererick's face and the moment she realized she had been drugged at his photography studio. Hearing Gabrielle's story made me understand how close I had come to her fate. If Robert had not acted, I would have woken up in a foreign country surrounded by men who had purchased me for their pleasure. I would have been beaten, raped, and brutalized until my spirit broke and I stopped fighting. Then I would have been discarded like trash when I was no longer profitable or useful. This was the future Dererick had planned for me on our wedding night while smiling and making toasts about our love and commitment. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. My brain could not reconcile the man who had held my hand during walks and remembered my coffee order with the predator who had selected me as merchandise for overseas buyers. My therapist said this was normal and it would take years to process the betrayal and trauma. She warned me against trying to understand Dererick's psychology or motivations because that path led to self-blame and rumination. Dererick made conscious choices to hurt people, and nothing I did or failed to do made me responsible for his actions. I needed to focus on rebuilding my life and finding meaning beyond the trauma he had inflicted. I moved back in with my parents temporarily while sorting out my finances and living situation. My old apartment had too many memories of Dererick and I could not sleep there without seeing him in every room. My employer at the law firm welcomed me back with full benefits and a promotion to senior paralegal. They had held my position open after I quit, assuming Dererick and I would start a family immediately. Now they understood Dererick had manipulated me into leaving so I would be more financially dependent and easier to control. My boss apologized for not recognizing the warning signs and said the firm would support me through the trial and recovery process. I appreciated their understanding but felt embarrassed that my personal life had become such public drama. Everyone at work knew what had happened because the news coverage was extensive. Some colleagues treated me with pity, which I hated. Others avoided me entirely, not knowing what to say. A few offered genuine support and became crucial friends during the hardest months. My friend Jennifer from accounting took me to lunch weekly and let me talk through my anger and confusion without judgment. She never made me feel weak or stupid for trusting Dererick. She simply listened and validated my feelings while reminding me I was not defined by what Dererick had done. The grand jury indictment came down 4 months after Dererick's arrest with 47 charges, including conspiracy to commit human trafficking, kidnapping, fraud, identity theft, and sexual assault. The prosecutor added sexual assault charges after reviewing the videos from Dererick's studio and determining several showed him touching unconscious women inappropriately. Forensic analysis confirmed Dererick had drugged at least 23 different clients over 18 months and photographed them while incapacitated. Some videos showed Dererick positioning women's bodies and removing clothing while they were unconscious. These acts constituted sexual assault under state law, even though Dererick had not committed rape. Each instance was charged separately, giving the prosecutor leverage to negotiate a longer sentence. Dererick's lawyer tried arguing the videos were staged with consenting models who had agreed to appear unconscious. But investigators contacted every woman in the videos and all of them confirmed they had no memory of the sessions, and certainly had not consented to being photographed unconscious or partially clothed. Several women broke down crying when shown the videos because they had trusted Dererick completely and never imagined he would violate them this way. My trial preparation began 6 months after the arrest when the prosecutor walked me through every piece of evidence I would need to testify about. She explained Dererick's defense would try portraying me as a willing participant who knew about his trafficking operation and planned to profit from it. This was absurd, but the prosecutor said juries sometimes believe defense narratives that blamed victims for their own victimization. I needed to remain calm and consistent in my testimony while describing how Dererick had deceived me. The prosecutor coached me on how to answer hostile cross-examination questions without becoming defensive or emotional. She said my credibility was crucial because I was the prosecution's key witness to Dererick's intent and planning around the wedding. My testimony about adding Dererick to my bank account and giving him access to my finances would demonstrate his pattern of financial exploitation. My description of Dererick's isolation tactics would show his methodical grooming process. And my shock at discovering his trafficking plan would humanize the case for jurors who might otherwise see trafficking as an abstract crime happening to anonymous victims overseas. I was not anonymous. I was an educated professional woman from a good family who had been targeted and nearly destroyed by a skilled predator. The week before trial, Dererick's lawyer made a final plea offer: 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole in exchange for Dererick testifying against the higher-level traffickers in his network. The prosecutor presented this offer to me and the other victims, asking our opinions. Melissa's family wanted Dererick to serve life without parole and rejected any deal. Amber was willing to accept the 25-year sentence to avoid testifying and reliving her trauma. Sophie wanted Dererick to face trial and be convicted on every charge regardless of sentencing. Rachel's parents were conflicted because they wanted Dererick imprisoned forever, but also wanted to protect their daughter from the trial. I told the prosecutor I would support whatever decision gave Dererick the longest possible sentence while protecting victims from further harm. If his testimony against other traffickers would save lives, then I could accept 25 years. But if he was simply trying to reduce his sentence without providing valuable information, then I wanted him to face trial. The prosecutor said Dererick's information was legitimate and could dismantle a major trafficking network operating across 6 countries. The FBI had already used Dererick's preliminary debriefing to locate 4 women being held in Romania and Turkey. Those rescues alone justified considering the deal, but then Stephen agreed to testify against Dererick in exchange for his own reduced sentence. Stephen's testimony eliminated the prosecution's need for Dererick's cooperation because Stephen knew everything Dererick knew and more. The prosecutor withdrew the plea offer and informed Dererick's lawyer they were proceeding to trial. Dererick's lawyer requested a continuance, claiming insufficient time to prepare, but the judge denied the motion. The trial was scheduled to begin in 3 weeks and would last approximately 6 weeks given the number of charges and witnesses. I requested time off from work and prepared mentally for the ordeal ahead. My therapist increased our sessions to twice weekly to help me cope with the anticipation and anxiety. She taught me grounding techniques for managing panic attacks and dissociation during testimony. She role-played hostile questions so I could practice staying centered while being attacked by defense attorneys. She reminded me constantly that I had survived the worst Dererick could do, and testifying about it could not hurt me more than the actual experience had. I repeated this mantra whenever fear threatened to overwhelm me. I survived. I am surviving. I will continue surviving. The trial began on a cold Monday in November, with jury selection taking 3 full days. Dererick's lawyer wanted jurors who would sympathize with claims that Dererick was mentally ill rather than evil. The prosecutor wanted jurors who understood trafficking as a serious crime and would not blame victims. They questioned hundreds of potential jurors about their views on human trafficking, sex work, personal responsibility, and mental illness. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men ranging in age from 28 to 67. The prosecutor seemed satisfied with the composition, but warned me that juries were unpredictable, and we needed to present overwhelming evidence to guarantee conviction. Opening statements began on Thursday with the prosecutor laying out Dererick's trafficking operation in brutal detail. She showed the jury photos of the storage unit contents, transcripts of messages between Dererick and Stephen, financial records proving payments for women, and testimony describing Dererick's predatory pattern. Then she introduced me as the woman Dererick had planned to traffic on their wedding night while pretending to love her. The jury turned and stared at me sitting in the front row, and I felt exposed and judged even though I had done nothing wrong. Dererick's lawyer gave his opening statement painting Dererick as a troubled man with undiagnosed mental illness who had been manipulated by Stephen into criminal activity. He claimed Dererick had genuine feelings for me and never would have hurt me, but Stephen had threatened Dererick's life if he did not cooperate with the wedding night plan. This narrative was contradicted by every piece of evidence, but the lawyer presented it convincingly enough that I saw 2 jurors nodding along. The prosecutor had warned me defense lawyers spin alternative facts, hoping to create reasonable doubt in even one juror's mind. That was why we needed overwhelming evidence showing Dererick's guilt beyond any doubt. The prosecution's case took 4 weeks, presenting 47 witnesses, including federal agents, Interpol investigators, Dererick's previous victims, forensic accountants, and technology experts who analyzed Dererick's encrypted communications. I testified on a Wednesday afternoon and was on the witness stand for 6 hours over 2 days. The prosecutor asked me to describe my relationship with Dererick from our first meeting through the wedding night disaster. I explained how Dererick had seemed perfect, attentive, and genuinely loving. I described his gradual isolation of me from friends and family that I had not recognized as manipulation until afterward. The prosecutor showed me text messages where Dererick convinced me my best friend was jealous of our relationship and causing drama I did not need. She showed bank records where Dererick slowly drained my savings with small transfers I had authorized thinking they were for wedding expenses or business investments. She showed photos of the offshore accounts where my money ended up, along with payments from trafficking buyers. Then she asked me to describe the wedding night when Robert drugged my champagne and exposed Dererick's plan. I walked through every moment, from Robert grabbing my glass to Dererick holding a knife to Melissa's throat to the police finding drugs in Dererick's jacket. Several jurors were crying as I described realizing the man I married had planned to sell me. The prosecutor asked how I felt learning my husband was a human trafficker. I said I felt devastated, violated, and angry, but mostly lucky that Robert had saved my life. Then Dererick's lawyer began his cross-examination, trying to suggest I had known about Dererick's trafficking operation. He asked if I ever questioned why Dererick traveled internationally so frequently. I said no, because Dererick told me he was visiting photography equipment suppliers, and I had no reason to doubt him. The lawyer asked if I ever saw the hidden room in Dererick's studio. I said no, because I was never in the basement. He asked if I knew Dererick used fake identification. I said no, because Dererick showed me his real driver's license. He asked if I benefited financially from Dererick's trafficking income. I said no, because I did not know the money existed until after his arrest. The lawyer kept trying to portray me as either complicit or willfully ignorant, but the prosecutor objected repeatedly, and the judge sustained most objections. After 3 hours of hostile cross-examination, the lawyer finally gave up and dismissed me. I walked back to my seat shaking and feeling like I had been attacked, but the prosecutor squeezed my hand and whispered I had done perfectly, and the jury believed me. Robert testified the next day, describing how he discovered Dererick's crimes and planned to expose him at the wedding. Robert's testimony was powerful because he had nothing to gain from testifying against his own son. The jury could see his pain and devastation as he explained choosing justice over family loyalty. Dererick's lawyer tried suggesting Robert had planted evidence or fabricated the trafficking plot to frame Dererick, but Robert's documentation was too thorough to dispute. The lawyer eventually stopped questioning, and Robert stepped down, looking 20 years older than when he started. Stephen testified for the prosecution under his plea agreement, explaining how Dererick had recruited him in college and taught him the trafficking operation. Stephen described Dererick as cold, calculating, and completely devoid of empathy for his victims. He said Dererick referred to trafficked women as inventory and discussed them the way someone might discuss furniture or appliances. Stephen admitted his own guilt and responsibility, but emphasized Dererick was the architect and primary operator of their network. Dererick had connections with buyers in 7 countries and had been trafficking women since he was 19 years old. Stephen had joined when he was 23, and Dererick was already experienced and successful. The defense tried discrediting Stephen by pointing out his own criminal history, but his testimony was corroborated by physical evidence and financial records. The jury seemed convinced by Stephen's account, especially when he broke down crying while describing one victim who had begged them not to put her on the plane. The defense case lasted 1 week and consisted mainly of mental health experts claiming Dererick suffered from various personality disorders that diminished his criminal responsibility. But the prosecution's rebuttal experts testified Dererick knew exactly what he was doing and chose to traffic women for profit, not because of mental illness. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 47 charges. Dererick showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, while his lawyer sat with his head in his hands, knowing the sentencing would be devastating. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later and remanded Dererick to custody. I cried with relief in the hallway outside the courtroom while my parents held me. We had won. Dererick would never hurt anyone again. Robert found me in the hallway and we hugged without speaking because there were no words for what we had survived together. The sentencing hearing was brief, with the prosecutor recommending life without parole based on the severity and scope of Dererick's crimes. Dererick's lawyer argued for 30 years, citing Dererick's age and potential for rehabilitation. The judge reviewed victim impact statements from all 19 identified victims, including mine, where I described how Dererick had destroyed my ability to trust or love freely. Then the judge sentenced Dererick to 6 consecutive life sentences plus 150 years, ensuring he would never leave prison. Dererick finally showed emotion then, screaming that the sentence was unjust and he had been framed. Guards dragged him from the courtroom while he continued ranting about conspiracies and corruption. The judge apologized to victims for the outburst and promised Dererick would be housed in maximum security isolation where he could not harm anyone ever again. The civil lawsuit settled shortly after the criminal conviction, with Dererick's insurance companies paying maximum policy limits to all victims. I received $500,000, which would never compensate for what Dererick did but helped me rebuild financially. Melissa's family received $750,000 and used part of it to start a nonprofit, helping trafficking survivors reintegrate into society. Amber received $400,000 and moved across the country to start fresh where nobody knew her story. Sophie received $350,000 and went back to school to become a therapist specializing in trauma. Rachel's family received $900,000 and put it in trust for her college education and future therapy needs. Robert refused any money, saying he had only done what was necessary and did not deserve compensation. The federal government seized Dererick's remaining assets and distributed them to victims through a restitution fund that would make ongoing payments as Dererick's trafficking network was further investigated. 2 years after Dererick's conviction, federal investigators had dismantled his entire trafficking network, arresting 23 people across 8 countries and rescuing 47 women being held in captivity. Interpol credited Robert's initial evidence as the breakthrough that made the entire operation possible. I stood in Robert's living room 5 years after the wedding that never happened, watching him play with my daughter Hannah on the floor. Robert had become my closest friend and surrogate father after my own dad passed from a heart attack 2 years ago. Hannah called him Papa and loved him completely, having no idea what he had saved her mother from before she was born. My husband Marcus sat on the couch smiling at his daughter's laughter, secure in knowing I had chosen him freely without manipulation or deception. We had met in trauma therapy and built a relationship slowly based on honesty and respect. Marcus knew everything about Dererick and had never made me feel damaged or broken because of it. Robert looked up at me with tears in his eyes, watching the scene of domestic happiness he had made possible. I mouthed the words "thank you," and he nodded, understanding everything I could not say. Some people never recover from the choices evil people force them to make, but Robert had chosen correctly despite the cost and given me a future worth living. That was a debt I could never repay, but would honor every single day by building the life Dererick tried to steal. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now, and let me know your take in the comments.